Good afternoon or good morning, depending on which side of the ocean you are at the moment. We are very happy to welcome you to the third webinar of the webinar series devoted to constitutionalism, trade, social justice, and sustainability in the Americas, lessons from the 2020 global pandemic. You can see on your screen the program, the entire schedule of this webinar series. This is the third one, as I mentioned. We had two webinars already in February. The first one was held on the 11th of February, and our speakers, Anousheh Farahat and Alberto Abad Suarez Avila, dealt with the issue of economic inequality and all the issues that were raised by the global pandemic in this respect. They analyzed this topic from a comparative perspective, contrasting the situation in Europe with the situation in the Americas. The second webinar we had on the 25th of February dealt with the impact and the role of international and global law with respect to the pandemic. The speakers of that webinar, which were Lorenzo Casini and René Urueña, focused in particular on distributive justice and the fact that probably international law of the future will also have to face this issue in addition to everything that has been covering over the past decades. Now, let me briefly introduce our host of the webinars. I'm the co-host. I'm Sabrina Aragone from the University of Bologna, because this webinar series is co-organized by the institution I belong to. Elizabeth Trujillo, Professor Trujillo, is a law professor at the University of Houston, and she is the founding director of the Initiative on Global Law and Policy for the Americas, which is organizing this webinar series. As you all may know, she writes and teaches in international trade and investment law, sustainable development and energy, contracts, and international law. She has published widely, extensively in many journals, books, etc. Her more recent work focuses on the trade considerations for domestic decarbonization strategies in the context of changing international economic legal frameworks, with an emphasis on the Americas. She has been the recipient of a von Humboldt Foundation Research Fellowship to pursue her research at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, where we actually met a few years ago. She's a member of the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law. And finally, last but not least, she's writing a book on shattered prisms, reconceptualizing trade through a sustainable development framework, which will be published by Cambridge University Press. So without further ado, I leave her the floor so that she can introduce this specific webinar. Thank you, Elizabeth. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabrina, for that warm welcome, and thank you for your collaboration and the collaboration of the University of Bologna. I also want to thank the American Society of International Law, the Latin America Interest Group, which is a co-sponsor, as well as the University of Houston's Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center, ENER, that is also co-sponsoring this particular webinar event. So thank you for their support. So I'm really excited about today's webinar, not only because it touches upon some of my own research in the climate change space as it pertains to international trade, but I'm looking forward to today's panelists that are experts in the area of both climate change and health, and bringing together these two topics in the context of COVID and the pandemic, I find to be very provocative, and also at the same time very relevant to what is happening today. There are two public emergencies that have both national and global repercussions. And so it allows us to think about some of those national and global aspects of the pandemic. Not only has this pandemic shown how sensitive the climate is to human action, but it also has allowed economies that are now more crippled by this pandemic to learn and to shift to better address other areas such as decarbonization strategies, as we're seeing happening in Europe. It also has demonstrated the need that there is for governance, both in areas of health as well as climate change, and governance that is better tailored to addressing both all of local, state, and national needs, as well as one that allows for global collaboration. So today's panel will touch upon all of these issues and more. And before I introduce our panelists, I just want to remind you that you can write your questions in the Q&A chat, which will be on your screen. And at the end of this presentation, we will have time for addressing your questions. So let me introduce our panelists. Our first speaker will be Professor Daniel Farber, who will speak on COVID-19 and climate change. Professor Farber is the Sho Satu Professor of Law and the Faculty Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Farber serves on the editorial board of the Foundation Press, is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a life member of the American Law Institute. And after graduating from the University of Illinois Law School, he was clerk for Judge Tone on the Seventh Circuit, as well as Justice John Paul Stevens on the Supreme Court. Professor Farber practiced law with Sidley Austin before returning to the University of Illinois as a faculty member in 1978. From 1981 to 2002, he taught at the University of Minnesota Law Faculty, where he was the McKnight Presidential Professor of Public Law. He's also been a visiting professor at Stanford Law, Harvard Law School, the University of Chicago Law School, and the author of leading books in constitutional law and the environmental law. So thank you, Professor Farber, for being here. Our discussant today is Pedro Villagrad, who is a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Law and International Law. He is the manager of the project there, International Health Governance. In 2017, he received the prize for the best doctoral dissertation in law and social sciences at the National Autonomous University of Mexico for his work, Pandemics and the Law, a Global Governance Perspective. And just on a personal note, I met Pedro when I was at the Max Planck Institute, and we had wonderful exchanges on many topics. It's really nice to see you again today and see how wonderful your research has developed at the Max Planck Institute. I miss our conversations on Mexico and Latin America and so many other things. So it's good to see you. Thank you both for being here. And with no further ado, I will pass the podium to Professor Farber. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to discuss the relationship between COVID and climate policy today. So I'm going to share my screen and have a few slides. Let me take care of doing that now. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and climate change, both of which are global crises. The COVID is a little more rapid onset crisis, but both of them are putting enormous stress on our institutions and are threatening or have already created worldwide harm. I thought it'd be good to start with the situation before COVID struck. In terms of climate change itself, 2010 to 2019 was the warmest decade since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And 2020, the year that we just finished, although sometimes it seems like it's still continuing, was also the year with the most disaster events in the United States, as well as tied for the hottest year globally. In terms of the governance picture, the Paris Agreement created a roadmap for addressing climate change. And one of the things that was most notable was that for the first time, developing countries agreed to play a role in controlling emissions. There's been a long-standing division with developing countries insisting that the developed countries had caused the problem and had the responsibility for addressing it, and the developed countries saying in turn that no solution was possible without the developing countries. So the Paris Agreement was a breakthrough in those terms. Unfortunately, President Trump announced in 2017 that the US would be withdrawing, although that did not become final until just a few days after our last presidential election because of the withdrawal mechanism in the Paris Agreement itself. Since our topic is climate change and public health, I wanted to say just briefly about the public health aspect of climate change, which is something I think that many people outside of the world of public health are unaware of. Climate change actually poses serious public health issues. one of which is the increase in dangerous heat waves. And I think probably very few people realize how many have already been killed by climate change. There was an enormous heat wave in Europe in 2003. The lowest figure I could see was 30,000 deaths, and the estimate range up to well over twice that number. Linked to, and that's been linked by climate modeling to climate change. We also expect that climate change will expand the range of infectious diseases like malaria and expose new population to those diseases. In addition, efforts to combat climate change will reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are being burned, and that will have substantially positive effects on public health. The estimates are that fine particulate pollution causes 2.5 million deaths a year in India and China alone, and many more if you look at the global picture. There's also some evidence that PM 2.5 pollution increases susceptibility to COVID because of the pre-existing damage to lungs. So what I want to talk about today, two things really. One is, what effects has COVID had on the economy and through the economy on carbon emissions? And will that effect last? Will there be policies relating to the COVID crisis that could actually promote emissions reductions? And then the second part is about COVID and climate governance. There are really some striking similarities between some of the issues in these two areas in terms of governance. And the question is, can we learn anything from COVID about what works and doesn't work in this setting? So let's start with the economy. This little picture on this slide shows crude oil prices in the early part of the COVID crisis. And what you see, although you can't read the numbers very easily, unfortunately, on this slide, is that there was a brief time in which crude oil prices actually went negative. That is, oil producers were paying to have people take their oil. This only lasted a very brief amount of time before prices went back up again above zero. But they remained very low for a significant amount of time and have gradually returned to about 2/3 of the pre-COVID level. So the oil industry has been hit very hard by the COVID. The reason obviously being that people weren't driving and they weren't traveling, and very few of them were flying. As a result of the economic shutdowns and the slowdown in transportation, what you see from this figure is a sharp decrease at the lowest point, down about 18% in carbon emissions due to COVID. And you can really see two different troughs in this curve. One was in February with China locking down. China, as you can see, if you just look at the brown or tan area here, China cut emissions very dramatically, rebounded by the middle of March. And then if you look forward, you'll basically see that they're back to normal by April, when the rest of the world is locking down. By mid-June, global emissions regained about 12%. And as I said, emissions in China were back to the previous level. Now, in terms of the impacts between COVID and pollution and carbon emissions, I think this picture is pretty dramatic. This is Beijing. The bottom slide is what it looks like on more or less normal days, and the top slide is what it looked like during the COVID lockdown. I think there were people in Beijing who had never really seen the, blue sky before. So this is not only a much more attractive picture, but also a much healthier one while it lasted, which was unfortunately, from that point of view, at least not very long. So we don't really know what will happen long term. For example, will people continue to do conferences like this one by Zoom and video conferencing, or will we all go back to flying around the country and around the world for meetings and leaving a trail of emissions behind us? Will people continue to work from home to a larger extent than they did beforehand, and so forth? But the other channel through which COVID could have a long-term effect on emissions is in terms of the post-COVID recovery measures. In Europe, there's been a serious effort to take advantage of the need for COVID stimulus to boost climate and environmental programs. So the EU stimulus program includes almost $500 million, 374 or so billion euros for climate and environment. Germany's own stimulus plan has $145 billion, which is about 1/3 of that. I'm sorry, that's the whole plan. About 1/3 of the funds are going to public transportation, electric vehicles, renewable energy as part of the recovery there. France is putting money into the electrical vehicle manufacturing and innovation in the hope of becoming a European center for creating electric vehicles. What about the US? We don't really know. There's just in the last day, the Congress passed a COVID Relief Act, but the Relief Act is really addressed to the immediate needs created by what remains a very substantial recession and with many people and institutions struggling financially. So this is very short-term relief. The question is, will there be a follow-up bill such as a proposed $2 trillion infrastructure bill? If there is, that will include at least some funding for transportation, building, energy efficiency, modernizing the power sector, environmental justice, but we don't really know, first of all, whether there will be an infrastructure bill, and second, how much of the bill will be devoted to those purposes. The politics in Congress are not at all clear. The Democrats have a very narrow majority, and they are going to have to make some compromises. But this is probably our best chance. The experience from the Obama stimulus measure, which also devoted substantial amounts of money to renewable energy and related resources, what we learned then was that that had apparently a permanent effect in terms of accelerating adoption of renewable energy. So it wasn't just that we accelerated spending that would have taken place otherwise by creating so much new infrastructure and allowing the industry to expand and achieve economies of scale. There really was a very noticeable shift in the trend line going forward for renewable energy. So we could hopefully see something like that again, both in Europe and in, hopefully, as I say, the United States. I want to turn then to questions about governance. Governance issues loom large, both for COVID and in the global public health area, and even in national public health schemes, as we've discovered in the United States and elsewhere. And as I said at the beginning, there are some really surprising parallels surprising in the sense that they're such very different crises in terms of many dimensions, including what's causing them, the sort of time scale, et cetera. So I thought I certainly don't have the knowledge or time today to talk about what's happening everywhere in the Americas, but I thought I would focus on Brazil and the United States, which are two of the largest countries in the Americas, and also have in the last few years went through a very similar period of populist government. So on the climate side, Bolsonaro, who's apologize, there's the typo in his name, and Trump both denied or minimized climate change, and both of them backtracked on previous climate policies in a major way. Bolsonaro mostly in terms of deforestation, and Trump in terms of fossil fuel production and emission standards for vehicles, power plants, et cetera. In both places, local governments, such as California in the United States and Sao Paulo in Brazil, have taken the lead in addressing climate change. And not just Sao Paulo or California, but those are, I think, two of the standout jurisdictions. So that decentralized strategy has been important. In fact, it's been important on the international level, not just in those two countries. Even in China, for example, we see some cities and municipal governments taking much more forthright action on climate change than others. But the decentralized strategy has been hindered by lack of national support in the Trump years and the Bolsonaro years, and by resistance from other regions within the same country. Another parallel, Trump withdrew from Paris, and Bolsonaro hasn't done so, but has threatened to do so. Now, I think there are similar similarities in terms of COVID governance. In Brazil and the United States, states like Washington State, and cities like Sao Paulo mounted vigorous responses after the initial outbreak. We also, after some delays, saw a pretty vigorous response in New York, another very hard hit area. While all that was going on, Trump and Bolsonaro denied the crisis. Both were opposed to public health measures like wearing masks, business closures, social distancing rules. Just last month, Bolsonaro said masks could lead to headaches, difficulty concentrating, and a decreased perception of happiness. A phrase that I found particularly, intriguing. Trump withdrew from the World Health Organization, the WHO, and Bolsonaro also has threatened to do so. Even more recent, in June 2020. So in both cases, we see kind of a combination of defaults by the national government, efforts to deal with the crisis by state and local governments, and interference with international or withdrawal from international cooperation. And that's true of both COVID and of climate change. So both between the countries and between these two crises, we see some real parallels. Now, of course, Trump and Bolsonaro are not necessarily typical of leaders around the globe. Every country has its own unique story, but I think that the trends that are dramatized by the two of them and by Brazil and the United States do have parallels elsewhere. So what can we learn from this about governance? I'm sure there are deeper lessons, but at least I think some of the lessons that we can learn go along the following lines. First of all, we often tend to focus on what national governments are doing. In traditionally international law, those are really the only actors that exist. And at least in the United States, I think scholars often focus on the federal government at the expense of other levels of government. Nonetheless, state and local responses can play a really important role in responding to even global crises, crises that are far beyond the scale of these jurisdictions themselves. However, they can't substitute for strong national responses or for international cooperation. What we see in both the US and Brazil is the way populism undermines crisis response, in part because experts get pushed to the side in favor of ideology. And in both the US and Brazil, I think that's been a sort of a notorious, that under Trump in the US and Bolsonaro in Brazil, that's been a really notorious trend. If anything, I think Bolsonaro has been even more outspoken in expressing contempt for expertise, but it was also clear in the case of Trump. And populism is not a force that's limited to those two countries. And then international institutions, although they certainly can provide a very useful forum for cooperation, are not yet strong enough to provide global leadership, especially without the backing of the most powerful countries to provide support and influence. So just to wrap up quickly, coronavirus caused a major drop in emissions, although they're moving higher again. The economic crisis, however, creates the opportunity for a green recovery, which could really advance climate action. And as I mentioned before, advancing climate action would also be good for public health. One aside, one of the things I discovered when I looked into the WHO when Trump threatened to withdraw, is that the WHO actually does a substantial amount of work on both air pollution issues in developing countries and on climate change. And that is because of the nexus with public health. COVID fits a pattern we've been seeing with climate change for a while, with individual jurisdictions taking the lead. And both climate change and COVID, like many other problems that we face in the world, highlight the need to strengthen international institutions. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing Pedro's commentary. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Professor Farber, for those that interesting presentation. I just want to remind everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A chat. I'm managing that, and we'll have time to answer some of those at the end. I want to go ahead and pass the baton over to Pedro for his response and comments. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Elizabeth, good, and Daniel as well, and Sabrina for bringing us together today. It is a pleasure to join you, and I feel quite fortunate to be in a position to comment on Daniel Farber's enlightening presentation. And I will focus then on certain common themes between Professor Farber's work on climate change and my own perspective from the area of global health. And I noticed that in the presentation, Daniel mentioned this factual link between climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. I would say that the link or nexus, as he put it, goes even deeper, seeing how it works the other way around, right? So in the presentation, we already saw how the impact of climate change may expand the range of infectious diseases that affect humans. So indeed, one of the main sources, if not the main source of pandemics in humans, are so-called zoonotic diseases, So diseases that jump between species, right? That are, for instance, in a first moment, only in the non-human animal realm. And then suddenly, because of the contact between humans and non-human animals, the disease makes the interspecies jump. And that's what caused the, well, the investigation is ongoing, but there seems to be a growing awareness that that's what the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic. And with climate change, there's also a growing body of evidence that shows how if climate change continues down this path, it may cause non-human animals as well to migrate from their current environments, right? And these non-human animals that may be disease carriers may then bring these diseases to the human interface. And so here we see the factual and the direct factual link or nexus between climate change and the pandemic risk, right? Insofar as it's being pointed out how this, you know, in the risk assessment for the future, how this situation will increase indeed, as Daniel mentioned, the risk of new diseases or diseases that are currently not present in humans making their way to the human population. And so on, and this situation leads me to one of the main threats in both these areas, climate change and health. That is the elephant in the room, if I may call it like that. And it is basically that the drivers of risk in both climate change and pandemics are directly related to human activities. There is an increasing realization in the medical and public health community that an emerging consensus, perhaps even, that the way in which we as humans interact with non-human animals and the environment as a whole is a key driver of pandemic risk. Whether it's in the trade of wildlife, deforestation, agricultural expansion, or indeed climate change, human activity is increasing the exposure to environmental and health threats. Just last month, the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, composed of experts of diverse fields, just issued a statement where this body of experts considered and emphasized that there is a need to address this human environment, human and non-human animals and environmental interactions that led to the emergence of COVID-19 and then may lead to other zoonotic diseases. So that the Lancet Commission does not only focus on better understanding the origins of the pandemic, but also reminds us of the need to come up with a plan that will promote a so-called green recovery, for instance, that is carbon neutral when all countries, and this will be gradual, start implementing their COVID-19 recovery plans. And on another matter, and we were discussing this a few minutes ago, and regarding the current status of the international regulation of pandemics or international health law more generally, in my opinion, and if we compare both fields, you know, environmental law and climate change regulation in particular, and health regulation at the international level, international health law is much less developed than environmental law. So if we look at existing international rules, such as the international health regulations, one key element is that these regulations consider the emergence of pandemics as inevitable, as a no-fault event. And therefore, international law on pandemic preparedness and response does not tackle the the drivers of pandemic risk caused by human activity. And this, again, was a gradual success of environmental law that was capable of eventually really addressing some of the main drivers of environmental risk and, of course, of climate change. But it is a major shortcoming, in my view, in the regulation of pandemics, since there hasn't been such a shift yet from, you know, taking human activity as the key source of risk that needs to be regulated. Rather, it's focused on pandemic response, preparedness and response. So we need to be prepared from when these events come up. And we also need to regulate the responses, right? So that they're not disproportionate and that they're the most effective ones. And international, on another point, international adjudication, I will mention briefly, has also played a notable role in using the tools of legal interpretation to further refine environmental law, both codified and customary, but this is not the case for pandemics. We do not have the same amount of judicial criteria on how to frame states' obligations during pandemics, whether they are common but differentiated responsibilities. And Daniel Farber mentioned as well, the major the major role that developing countries, for instance, can play in coming up with tailored frameworks for understanding legal obligations. But there is no understanding on how, for instance, states should conduct health risk assessments, unlike environmental impact assessments. This is unclear and framed more as soft obligations. So if they want to, they can, but there is no strong real regulation of how states should conduct their health risk assessments and what elements do they need to take into account when they do so, which could include, for instance, the environmental factors. So in my view, international law on pandemics has a lot to learn from environmental law in this regard, since it has been an impressive decades-long development. And I would like to focus on two questions then for the debate that I will put in, that I would like to raise. So revisiting Daniel's claim that international institutions are not yet strong enough. So in my view, it's related indeed to the fact that the main structures of political decision-making and accountability are rooted in the national level still. So it leads, and this relates to a long-standing concern of how to procure global public goods, such as the protection against climate change or the protection against pandemics, through international law or through governance, on the basis of such national-oriented political system, right? How can we somehow look beyond the national-focused political systems where accountability is towards a country's own population? And we see it now with the race to secure a vaccine. Political leaders give preference to their own populations because they're ultimately accountable to them, right? And this is, again, a problem that is a persistent one and that affects both, I would say, in climate change regulation at the international level, and for sure in pandemics, in pandemic response. And lastly, I will mention another point where we could have a follow-up discussion if you would like to, and namely on the role of expertise within political processes that can lead eventually to regulation or to implementing solutions. So Professor Farber highlighted the examples of Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil to underscore why the current international consensus on actions against climate change and expressed in legal instruments such as the Paris Agreement and others. So this consensus is perhaps more fragile than one would assume, right? At any moment, science denialism may gain political traction. And this is reflected in the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic by the United States under Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil. So some open questions to me are the following, related to this topic of the role of expertise within political processes. How do we make sure that this expertise will lead to a necessary political engagement? So if we start from the premise that we need to face or counter the Trumps and Bolsonaros of this world, how do we deploy expert knowledge so that it may reach the actors that are ultimately responsible for adopting policies regarding problems that affect literally all of mankind? Do we remain with a strict separation between expertise on one hand and the political realm on the other hand? given how, scientific knowledge claim, for instance, of being apolitical is one of its main sources of legitimacy often. And this matter also, I would say, touches upon legal scholarship. So how can we address this relationship in a way that somehow helps ensure that science denialism will not prevail? This to me is a pending question, because from this, the response to this question will determine the path taking by, the path taken at the international and at the national levels. So thanks again for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the ensuing discussion.
Well, thank you. Those are two very large questions. I only wish I could give complete answers and solve these dilemmas. But let me offer some reflections. I think one thing that's been interesting in the climate change area is the diverse forms that international cooperation has taken. For example, I talked earlier about actions by states and cities in the climate change area. One thing that I didn't bring up was that these are not purely localized efforts. In fact, there are very active international organizations of states and cities, sometimes joined by major corporations on climate change, where they both, I think, provide mutual support, but also have the opportunity to share expertise and combine their strengths in policymaking. There's also been a sort of evolution in what we've been able to accomplish purely at the international level. The original hope was to have something like the Kyoto Agreement that would serve as a controlling international document where ideally all countries would have mandatory emission requirements. And that turns out to be impossible because of the great diversity of, desirable, I still believe, but politically impossible because of the great diversity in the standing points of different countries, economically and politically. So what we've evolved is some international institutions, the UN Framework Convention and its conferences of the parties. We also have the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which provides authoritative scientific and very detailed information about the state of knowledge of climate change. We've also had a creation of some international funding institutions, although they're really dramatically underfunded right now, and involvement by existing institutions like the World Bank in the climate issue. So instead of having a tidy kind of unified international approach, what we've had are a growth of different kinds of institutions and also bilateral and regional undertakings. US-China cooperation at sometimes has been very important, for example, and the EU has also been active. And we may need to think about a variety of different approaches in the public health area too. So maybe some of what's happened in the climate area could be helpful in thinking, I'm not really in a position to say, but maybe some of these sort of innovations in governance could be helpful. The question of how to ensure that science has a voice in decision-making is a really hard one. I mean, you would hope that in the 21st century, this would not even be a subject for discussion. It would be just an unquestioned axiom that, of course, science would play a central role. And we're struggling with that in the United States, having come out of the Trump era. I think one of the lessons is the need to protect scientists so that they can voice their opinions freely. There's been concern by the Biden administration about reestablishing scientific integrity within the government so that at least the scientists are able to give their opinions and evidence without fear. We have mechanisms that are supposed to help ensure that the president listens to those voices, such as we have a formal position of a science advisor to the president and so on. But none of that can guarantee that the president will listen. In some area, I think it's especially been a problem with, it's been a problem clearly with climate change as well, but maybe even more of a problem with COVID, because in US policymaking, until the time we get new national legislation, policymaking takes place within the framework of existing environmental laws, all of which have their own mechanisms for incorporating science in decisions. Now, those mechanisms didn't work as well under Trump as they have otherwise, but there were limits to how far Trump could and his administration could ignore science without being reversed by the courts. In the COVID area, however, there's really almost no framework. There are emergency powers that the Center for Disease Control has. There are other emergency powers that the president has. And this is also true at the state level of the actions of governors. They're very open-ended, and there's very little judicial involvement. And so you didn't have these sort of decision-making structures that limited the extent to which the government could just ignore science, right? That you didn't have this, you didn't have the requirement that they make specific determinations about risk, for example. You have that to some extent with the Food and Drug Administration and drug approval. And that did, despite some pressure from Trump, I think continued to have a lot more integrity than some of the government's other decision-making. But I think we're really talking in part about the need for a cultural change, not just a change in governance. And I only wish I had an answer to how we can make that happen.
Great. Thank you both for this really amazing discussion and interesting points that were made. I was just reflecting as Dan was responding to Pedro about, Pedro's comment about that there's no health impact assessment, right? So as we do have in the environmental side. And so, and that sort of leads to a question that was asked in the chat, and also one of my own questions, which is, where should governance happen? Like, should we develop a new framework that links health more specifically to environment to address issues of pandemics? And so in which we may be able to link the health aspects of environmental issues or climate change more readily. Should that happen at the international level, or should that happen nationally, or both? And how would that work? That's one question. And another question is from our audience. So international states have been unwilling to work with the international framework. We've seen that in the last few years. They were unwilling to cede the power, unwilling to provide the economic resources. And so we have all these fractured responses. So what, in your views, would induce states to be more willing to do that? Is there, obviously there's no one solution to these problems, but can you think of some tools that maybe legal tools like we have in the subsidiarity context in Europe, right? That helps sort of connect the national response to international response a little bit better? Are there other tools that might incentivize states to do that better? And then one last question, what is the role of corporations in all of this? We've seen that in responses to the pandemic, in some instances, the corporations have been more responsive, right? In requiring masks, for example, than the governments themselves. So is there a role they can play as well, whether it's in terms of expertise or in terms of, mitigation for climate change and health pandemic issues?
That's a lot to take on, and I'm not sure how much time we have left.
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, so I think this sort of erosion of these boundaries between different areas like health and environment is a really important development, and it's one that's not just limited to health. One of the other areas I'm interested in is risks from natural disasters. International disaster law, like public health, has been kind of a little area to itself, one in which unusually a leading role has been played by a non-governmental organization, the Red Cross and Crescents. It's been really completely unconnected with issues of environment. And one of the things we've seen in that area is that disaster issues are starting to become part of international climate negotiations, because climate change will intensify those risks. We were talking about the power blackouts in Houston before we started, and in Texas, and that kind of extreme weather event is something we're going to be seeing a lot more of under climate change. So it's become part of climate negotiations, and at the same time, the international law authorities in the area of disaster law are now beginning, I would say, to devote explicit attention to climate change issues. And one of the challenges is going to be to work out how institutions that have grown up in dealing with specific problems can now learn to work together more effectively when these problem spaces start intersecting. How can we strengthen international response? Again, this is partly a matter of very large issues about governance and nations. But I do think one of the things that we're seeing is a kind of diffusion of what internationalism means, with both the very important traditional international institutions and framework of public international law, but also with alternative transnational institutions growing up, including the state and local associations in climate change that I talked about, but also the involvement of often multinational corporations that are active both in the climate space and in the response to COVID, and that may also connect with state and local governments and with national governments and with international institutions. And so it may be that rather than what might be the ideal solution of simply, making the UN a more powerful institution and more capable of serving an international governance role, what we may find is that we need to create a whole series of overlapping networks of what I've sometimes called an ecosystem of international cooperation and governance that will not be necessarily clearly centralized in one set of institutions, but that can increase our ability to cooperate internationally through a whole bunch of different channels. At least that's about the best answer I can come up with at this point.
Great, thank you. Pedro, did you want to say a few words? I know in the chat, there has been an interesting exchange about health impact assessments from my colleague, Victor Splatt, who I appreciate the point raised. I don't know if you would like to say something about that or anything else that we've been talking about.
Yes, gladly. Actually, it is a good point that under the no harm principle that applies, for instance, as well to international environmental law. Of course, it can be argued that no harm principle also affects health. And indeed the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, in an advisory opinion, considered that whenever states undertake infrastructure projects, they should, within their impact assessments, they should include the risk that it poses to the health of persons in other countries. Right. Of course, this was an advisory opinion. It wasn't a dispute, and it hasn't yet been established, unlike, the International Court of Justice's case between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. The health impact assessments had not been consolidated as one part of customary international law. I mean, maybe, again, it could be inferred from the more general no harm principle that if the activities taken in one state affect the health of the populations in other states, I mean, this would be indeed a source of, this could lead to legal responsibility. However, it brings me back to one point and back to this discussion on the role of scientific knowledge. Indeed, I think in terms of this nexus between climate change or the environment more generally and public health, I mean, there's, the scientific evidence is evolving, right? So maybe we do not have if I may put it colloquially, the headshot or really the gold standard in terms of scientific evidence that show, and here is the nexus, and this is how it works, and the full explanation that, for instance, could be used later either in courts as the proof of correlation or even of causation, depending on what the court standard is. So this is, again, another challenge that is also on the side of science, right? So we also need to look at science and see whether it's doing everything possible to look and to collect evidence on this nexus, but there is an emerging evidence indeed, I would say, of this nexus. I don't know if, well, I know that time is short, so I don't know if there.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I wish we had more time to continue the discussion. I thought I would just close with just sort of summarizing a few key points that really resonated with me, which is just how decentralized both frameworks are, both climate change and health. But clearly more has been done on the environmental side, just maybe because of more years of working on some of these issues, because we have an international environmental framework in addition to our national regulatory frameworks that deal with the environment. So that is hopeful, although complicated, but maybe we need something similar in the health area where we have weaker international and national institutions that just focus on these types of emergencies. The role of science, I think, clearly is something that resonated with me, and how to manage risk and who manages that risk, and how do we assess risk, under what terms, under what guidelines, right? We have the precautionary principle on the international side, but that clearly nationally is very controversial. So we have some of those issues. And then there are various actors that come into play here in terms of the private, the transnational organizations, new organizations, civic society that's popping up around these issues, as well as government. So thank you all. Please, everyone, join me in thanking our panelists for this fantastic discussion. And I want to pass it on to my colleague, Sabrina, to just give us a short announcement about next week's webinar. And I also encourage everyone to look on the GLAPA page for summaries of each of the webinars that are posted every week, as well as recordings. So thank you very much to everyone who has attended.
Thanks a lot. Also from my side, you can see here the information about next week's seminar. This time we will have just 1 week in between the webinars. It's going to be next week on the 18th of March, and the topic will be, as it was already mentioned, international trade. So the impact of COVID-19 on international trade. We will have as the speaker Gabriel Marceau from WTO, and then two excellent discussants, Professor Trujillo and Professor Frank Garcia from the Boston College Law School, and I will be the chair. So hopefully we will see you all next week. Thanks again to the speakers, and of course to Elizabeth and all participants. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Till next
much.
week. Thank you. Thank you.
See you next time.
See you next time. Thank you.